Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a brand new video style here on the channel where I will be taking trilogies so I can both review and rank all of the entries of said trilogy with the setup you see before you. You can see the name of the film, its year of release, the movie poster, the Rotten Tomatoes summary and scores, and finally my score, which will of course be filled in when appropriate. But enough of pointing out the obvious, let's start by reviewing the first film in the Planet of the Apes trilogy known as Rise of the Planet of the Apes, released back in 2011. So let me start off by saying all three of these movies are really good, and this one here is no exception. It follows Will Rodman, a lead scientist on a cure for brain diseases. They experiment on apes, and this cure they're working on actually grants the apes heightened intelligence. So the day came to pitch this cure that the scientists were working on, but unfortunately Will's ape, meant to demonstrate the capabilities of this cure, went crazy and started attacking all the scientists, and after a chaotic rampage, the poor ape is shot by a security guard. The project is shut down and all of the apes are forced to be put down. It's very big sad, in case you can't tell by the tone of my voice, but this right here is when it's noticed by Frances that the ape was only acting out because she was afraid they'd hurt her newborn baby, and so that is really where Francis drew the line. He was willing to put on all the other apes. When it came to the baby, well, he practically begged Will to sneak him out of the laboratory so he weren't forced to put him down, and he left the choice up to Will, because since he wasn't going to put him down himself, it was up to Will as to whether he puts down the baby or sneaks it home, as I just said. And of course he sneaks it home. Who would dare harm a cute, innocent, newborn ape? And soon he realizes that because his mother was exposed to this cure the lab was creating, the genes passed on to this newborn ape, which he named Caesar, allowing his intelligence to be heightened like that of his mother. Caesar learns to care for his new family, including that of Will's father, who unfortunately suffers from dementia. So when he gets into trouble with neighbours, Caesar jumps in, but his natural violent actions cause for neighbour's finger to be bit off, which is very cleverly composed within the frame, because we can see quite clearly that he's pointing towards the father, he's threatening Will's father, and so Caesar takes that finger that he was using to threaten him, and that's the specific finger he bites off, because that's what he sees as the sign of violence. But he feels as though violence is the only way to cure violence, and of course that's not the greatest way, but he's an ape, he can't really tell that for himself. It's just within his nature, which is why I said his natural violent actions cause this violence. And naturally this led to Caesar having to be locked up with a bunch of apes, where he takes over as the alpha, and he grabs a few samples of this cure that Will's lab is working on, mind you, and makes all of his fellow apes smarter. So together they all raid the lab and set free the apes which were being experimented on, so that they all can escape into the woods outside the city of San Francisco, because there are several wide cinematic shots of the Golden Gate Bridge, and man, does it look glorious. In the end, Will chases after Caesar, asks him to come home, but Caesar has already found his home, so the two part ways, and that's where the movie closes. But the final scene of the film reveals that the cure which heightened the intelligence of these apes was extremely volatile to humans and extremely contagious as well. So the end of the movie baits the idea that this deadly disease is about to spread globally, like a pandemic. Oh, how appropriate I chose to review these films now of all times. But anyways, that is the basic summary of the story, and overall I really like it. It raises moral questions about experimental animals even, and naturally that gives us a side to root for and a side to root against, and we don't want to see these apes hurt by the humans whose only care is that of money. We have certain scientists like Will, whose motivation for the creation of the cure is to help and benefit humanity, more specifically Will's father, who's suffering from dementia. But most of the cases is that these humans are really money hungry and out for power over this knowledge of being able to help others, and so naturally that's not the most likable trait, and we find ourselves easily rooting against them. And normally actions occur before the motivation is revealed, which is genius storytelling, because you have these big exciting moments which raise questions, and then soon after you are rewarded for questioning the situation with an answer to all these questions that generally pays off really well. It also increases the rewatch value as you watch these scenes with the added context as to why these characters are doing what they are doing, and the dramatic irony really helps build up the tension you feel as the scene plays out. It makes all of our characters feel fleshed out and relatable, so naturally we are engaged thoroughly in their story and satisfied by their arc's natural conclusion, because we can see ourselves in these characters and ultimately picture ourselves in their situation. And that's thanks to the film striving for such a realistic look. The detail on the apes and the special effects as a whole are fantastic and make the film incredibly visually gripping to watch. The wide cinematic shots look grand and truly capture a very wide scope to thoroughly entertain and immerse you in the fast-paced, exciting and chaotic action sequences. But all these factors in combination with one another do bring up a few issues, however. First of all, not all these characters can really be all that fleshed out, as some of their motivations are generic and one-layered. I mentioned before about the money-hungry characters, such as the boss of the lab they're developing the cure at, and since there is only a sole motivation here, money, again it adds to the idea that they're purely there to root against. There is no other purpose for them rather than to drive the story forward and give you someone to hate. Because of that, because they're lacking in the layers and dimensions, they just don't have that natural human feeling to them, because humans are sophisticated, incredible creatures with multi-complex emotions and motivations, so naturally having characters as simple and as basic as this just make them feel like a plank of wood inserted to the story for the sake of purpose rather than adding something to the overarching feel and experience of the film. You don't experience these characters, you simply just passively watch them interact with other characters, and that's just dull and boring. And hey, it is far less satisfying to see the main villain's undoing as he's motivated by money and nothing else, because when we see the undoing of villains, it's all the more satisfying when we find ourselves more immersed and engaged by their character. But because that doesn't happen in this case, the satisfaction of him being defeated in the end is lost in translation, since he simply just doesn't feel human enough. But now we get to move on to Love's Will Interest, who was such a flat and one-dimensional character. I can't even remember the name of her, because she's simply there to provide Will with a love interest throughout the movie. She's as one-dimensional as they come, though I do love the dynamic between the two characters. There certainly is romantic chemistry between them, so at the very minimal, she is an entertaining character, even if not a particularly well-written one. And the idea of this story being so one-sided and read only one way, and that humans are evil and nothing more, also adds to the basic feeling of this movie. And instead of us as a viewer being torn between the two species, like that would have been much more fully gripping even, and topped up to the brim with tension, because we're worried about either side. Instead, what we get is a passive experience which doesn't make us put into question who's right and who's wrong. There is a clear-cut answer only to be interpreted a single way, and that is where the film loses a lot of the potential, where it could have really split and fully engaged you as a viewer, but instead of experiencing the movie, we are simply just watching it. And then there are also the pacing issues. As I mentioned, there are fast-paced, chaotic and visually stunning sequences. When you compare those to the story-building sequences, so much of this film is establishing and building the foundation for the rest of the trilogy to follow, and due to that, all of these sequences that I mentioned about are so slow-paced and put a huge drag onto the pace, and compared to that of the fast-paced, chaotic, heavy, visually stunning sequences with, the heavy visual effects, which is what I'm going as far to say right here. And Overall, it is a great movie with stunning visual effects and a huge degree of realism that allows you to truly put yourself into this film and questions characters' intentions until their motivations are revealed after the consequences, which really speak to your human compassion and make you feel sorry for these characters and ultimately root for them, even if the film is rather one-sided and doesn't make you split on who you're rooting for. So instead, you just passively root for the apes without question, which does lose a lot of what could have made this film all the more distinctive and clever if you could have found yourself split on who to root for. Though I do love all of the characters' dynamics. They really sell us on how much the characters care for one another based on the incredibly expressive body language of Caesar and the chemistry all of these characters share with one another. The film has its consequences for mistakes, giving us humans something to learn about human animal testing and for morality around it. I don't know why I can't say morality around it. That's the complete wrong pronunciation. But regardless, the ideas and themes of this, the ideas of humans having this natural violence towards apes is really well captured, and certain areas of the script are certainly flawed, such as the one-dimensional characters which harm your investment in the film overall, because they feel written in with the sole purpose to push the story forward rather than being their own characters in and of themselves. They're simply just not human, and that feeling is ultimately what hurts your immersion and further frustrates you at what this film could have been. But yes, that was a conclusion of sorts, it's a really long-winded way of saying that the film can also be poorly paced at points, but regardless of all of these transitions, I want to talk lastly about the acting and just how phenomenal it is for the most part, especially from that of the apes who were motion captured, so naturally are really expressive thanks to the excellent acting work, and that's what allowed for visual effects artists to come in and detail these apes to such an extent to truly give them that realistic look and make the film as visually stunning as it is. So naturally I'm going to be giving the film an 8 out of 10. But I've talked about it for far too long, so now let's move on to Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. This film takes place 10 years later, and the film opens up with that disease from the end of the first movie having it spread globally and causing a global-wide pandemic, suffering a 1 in 500 survival rate. So naturally, if a few humans all left alive have the virus living within them, and even if they have survived, the society around them has came crumbling down even, and they need power in order to survive. And when on a reconnaissance mission in the woodlands, the apes have built their society out there, so the two cross paths, and unfortunately one human wound up threatening the apes and shooting one of them, so Caesar does wind up letting him go in the end, but he still winds up following them back to their base to give the humans a warning to leave them alone. They are only after peace, the same as what the humans are, but neither side wants to fight. However, the humans need the power found within that woodlands because there is a dam out there, and unfortunately this dam is within the woodlands, which, as I've already said, is part of the apes' new built society, and it's where they are out not only to survive but to thrive. So naturally Malcolm approaches the apes peacefully, hoping that they can be left to do their work on the dam, and then they will leave the apes in peace as they've requested, so both sides can continue to survive. Of course, the humans still push their luck. They threaten the apes and bring weapons with them, so their natural need for violence is what brings about war in the end. It's Cobra who can't escape his hate and wants to wipe out all of the humans before they do so to them, because he realizes that, or at least he has built up in his mind, that humans can't move past their natural need for violence, as I previously alluded to. So naturally he shoots Caesar and frames the humans for it and starts war against the humans, killing any ape that challenges his rule, all because he never saw a good side to humans, unlike Caesar, who was raised by them. And yes, that was an incredibly basic summary of what is a wide and expansive story. that's far more impactful and thought-provoking than I could possibly ever hope to replicate with just the use of my voice alone, because it's a great expansion upon the first film's themes and characters, as any good sequel should do, since it has some constant exciting sequences to watch, and the events are structured and lead to one another to build up meaning and engagement from the viewer's behalf. Unlike the first film, we are split as to who to root for, making the conflict all the more intense and engaging, as this time the consequences don't fall upon the individuals but upon the entire groups of the species at hand, and these consequences are brought about by the few extremists from either side, the humans who are needlessly cruel and the apes who can't escape their hate and need for vengeance. It's the actions of these few who win out over the actions of the many, because characters like Malcolm and Caesar, they are selfless and building a friendship that could spark an everlasting peace between humans and apes. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, humans are threatening apes and the apes are killing humans in sight mercilessly. You can truly see either side of the conflict, and the one true villain, Cobra, is given far more depth than that of any of the prior villains, with strong motivation and pure intimidation. You are frightened by this guy's warpath, his power amongst the apes, and even his appearance. He has battle scars and visual wounds, which makes him look like a hardened warrior, someone not to mess around with, someone unforgiving due to a traumatic past. So the design of his character alone just, oh boy, it gives you goosebumps from the pure intimidation factor of his design. And the greatest praise I have for this movie is the time jump, watching how the ape society has evolved and is thriving in comparison to how the human society has fallen. And it's really compelling visually, just like the previous film. Is it's stunning to look at with all of the detailed visual effects to really add to the realism captured within the frame composition of these shots to truly build up meaning. It's a very competently crafted film, in other words. And in this film, its entirety speaks to human compassion. Either side has lost things and have suffered in one way or another, and you ultimately want none of them to continue suffering, and that what you're rooting for in the end even is peace. But the theme of violence prevails in this movie. Whenever you have a heartwarming moment which makes you feel like this goal of peace is ultimately accomplishable, and that feeling of peace being right on your grasp, or right in the character's grasp even, feels tangible to you as a viewer, and and the film gives you something to thoroughly believe in, it's directly juxtaposed by something cruel and evil on behalf of one of the side's extremists who can't let go of their hate and need for violence. Its rollercoaster of emotions is thoroughly gripping and memorable. Towards the end, we are reminded of the relationship between Caesar and Will and its importance in helping Caesar see the good in humans. It's a relationship which became the foundation for his character arc, which is maintained and expanded upon even further in this film. Maurice and Rocket are likeable as always, with Maurice being a voice of reason, and his relationship with Alexander is so heartwarming to watch. So overall, I love watching these characters and their interactions. They are incredibly expressive through the body language, and the chemistry truly brings about some thoroughly entertaining dynamics between the characters. And then there is also Malcolm, who is layered and enjoyable as a main protagonist to watch of the human side, as he is certainly capable, at least physically, so you're not annoyed by him being underpowered because you really care for him. Since he is so human, he possesses that human passion and forgivefulness, as does his wife, making that relationship rather compelling and full of romantic chemistry. But overall, it's his selflessness that allows you to root for him, and for us to wish all humans in this world were as thoughtful and forgiving as he was. They may just want to defend themselves, but their rush to violence is unforgivable, and it's easy to see from either viewpoint because of this. In conclusion, I love the themes and the characters in this movie. It's far more fast-paced due to the consistent conflict, which is made all the more compelling by how the film splits who you are rooting for. Either side is given clear-cut motivation, which we understand as viewers, and its theme of violence offers up self-reflections as we humans want to be like Malcolm, as he speaks to our human compassion, not like the other violent ones. But this violence theme is expressed throughout the plot's excellent structure, as any time there is anything fulfilling and heartfelt, it's juxtaposed immediately by violence, reminding us that in the end, violence always prevails. It takes everything great about the first film and expands upon it, maintaining its incredible visuals and throwing us directly into a great timeline as we see 10 years after the first film, where the ape society has evolved and is thriving, meanwhile the human society is diminished and ruined. I do think the film has a few problems, and that plot points are brought about by inconvenience and misunderstandings, and this style of building up the plot is generic and predictable. There are large chunks of the movie where we don't see the human society altogether, and that can put a few minor pacing issues onto the film. And whilst characters like Maurice and Rocket are fun to watch with excellent charisma and energy, they ultimately don't go through much of an arc of sorts. They are practically the same in the end as they were at the beginning, and that's rather frustrating, as you want to see these characters grow, but unfortunately it doesn't quite wind up that way. But still, the visual style of the film and how they visually showcase the downfall of the human society through the overgrowing of plants and, you know, all of the kind of nature running rampant, you know, it goes to show that a fight against humans and Mother Nature wins every time. And so the overgrowthness of San Francisco makes the film naturally a great visual representation of its themes and just how the human society has been diminished over these 10 years between the two films. It's just so well visually captured, and I cannot emphasize enough the thought that went into the production design of this film and how incredible it is. So ultimately, just like the theme of violence in this film and how it's used to juxtapose the heartwarming moments I have here, the flaws of this movie, which ultimately seem like nothing but nitpicks in comparison to all of the things this film gets right. So therefore, I'm giving this film a 9 out of 10. But now, without further ado, let's head into the final film of the trilogy, War of the Planet of the Apes. It's time for full-blown war between the apes and the humans. While Caesar attempts for peace, his actions are completely in vain as his son and Rocket return from a reconnaissance mission. They find a barren deserts where the apes can live in peace, as the humans would never find them there. But before all the apes can move, humans ambush their base, and unfortunately Caesar's wife and son are killed. So now he seeks his revenge against the colonel of the human army. Rocket, Maurice and Luba help him on his personal quest for vengeance, and in context, this is all happening after Caesar's offering for peace even, and of course it's juxtaposed by the vile cruelty beyond forgiveness of the humans. So ultimately we wind up rooting for Caesar here. You want to see the humans suffer the consequences of their actions, more specifically the colonel, as you're really built up to hate this character. We've grown to know Caesar throughout the course of these films, and so this trilogy ender uses that to its advantage, as it makes Caesar more violent than he ever was before, and this out of character notion makes us start to fear that he may lose himself in his hatred for humans. And we start to see even more and more of Cobra growing within him, and the fact that the consequences of Cobra lives on even after his death goes to show how powerful of a character he was as a villain, based on his influence and the ongoing consequences of his actions that remind us of how strong of a character he was. Along the way, a small girl is found who can't speak, so the apes take good care of her as the humans straight up abandon her, and this shows us that more humanity live in those apes than what is left even of the human race, who are shooting other humans' arsight, an act of true cruelty, and we learn they are doing it to anyone who loses their speech, same as this mysterious girl that they've rescued along the way. At first, we don't understand the cruelty behind these humans, but as the plot advances, Luba is unfortunately killed in the act of saving Caesar, and when he is captured by the humans only a few scenes later, we learn that all of the apes, the entirety of them, were captured by these humans along the way. So the irony of this is that if Caesar never went on this quest for vengeance, then he and the other apes that went alongside him would have been captured alongside the entirety of the apes, and there would have been no hope moving forward. So by taking this cruel path that's really brutal and beats us down as viewers because it's so dark in tone, ultimately by taking that path, that's what gave these apes a chance, a small one, because, you know, they're going up against an entire army and they already have the disadvantage because they've already been captured, and yet still it's a chance all the same that we never would have had without this quest for vengeance. So in the process of doing something that's naturally frowned upon and considered to be quite evil and, as I said earlier, out of character for Caesar, it's somehow brought about hope for these apes, and so that's the awesome irony behind all you go as far to say. Not sure whether I'll call it awesome, but it most certainly is ironic all the same. Now, this colonel found that the virus that lives inside all humans has mutated, depriving the victims of their humanity as they lose basic human function. His son caught it and he learnt from him that putting them down rather than allowing them to suffer losing their own humanity is what true mercy looks like. Because of this, a different human faction has gone to war with Colonel, finding his extreme way of doing things as something which needs to be stopped. So that is why he has forced on the apes that they all captured to build a wall in defense as the human faction comes to wipe out him and his forces. Caesar challenges his cruelty and demands food and water for the apes. He's almost shocked that the apes continue to work in order to save him from the colonel's cruelty. I keep calling him cruel because his motivation is what makes him layered. He's an excellent villain because to no extent do you think what he's doing is right, but you see where he's coming from, and per his own believing, he solidly believes that what he's doing is right, and that makes his character rather compelling and incredibly dangerous too, because he will not stop, he will not sway from his path, because he is so intent on delivering upon his own form of mercy, which you can't see right now, but I'm putting that in quotation marks, because mercy is something up to interpretation. It's something that, you know, we all give a different definition to, and so his form of mercy, with its cruel yet understanding methods, is so compelling, and it really engages and grips you as a viewer beyond belief and beyond words, you could even go as far to saying. Anyways, the apes receive food and water except for Caesar, but in the process that saved their life. So Caesar's devotion to his apes is ultimately what saved him in the end, even if as an audience we were made to question that in the prior scene, as the colonel points out that if Caesar did kill him, what would have become of his apes? Was he willing to sacrifice them to fulfill upon his revenge? And, you know, of course we have from that Woody Harrelson's charming performance exclaiming about how Caesar's so driven by emotion, and he's so emotional, which is just so charismatic and full of energy. I love Woody Harrelson's performance here, but we'll talk about that more later. It just, the structure of this plot, because of course we're questioning Caesar's intentions here, but yet that's directly juxtaposed by the outcome of his actions, saving the apes by getting them food and water. It's ultimately the juxtaposition of this scene that makes it so powerful emotionally. In fact, the entire film in its brutality is full to the brim with emotion. The death of Caesar's son and wife is extremely upsetting and so brutal, in fact, that it makes the film incredibly difficult to sit through at times. Luckily, the dark tone of this film is blended perfectly with a slight comedic tone. There is slapstick humour which really lands and acts as a great relaxer from the dark themes of revenge and mercy. Mercy being something which differs so differently between the Colonel and Caesar is what makes it such a compelling theme, as it's strictly open to interpretation, and the direction of this film is what makes it so fantastic in terms of its execution, because of the multiple viewpoints which you as the audience can see, and how well it's structured to bring development, build up our characters, and ultimately further the plot in very expressive and unique ways with style and substance. So naturally, its structure does add a lot to the plot, is what I'm saying here, with such little exposition. The pacing is always moving forward with distinctiveness and memorability in how the film is directed. I especially love how the human girl learns sign language through the apes' interactions with one another. Caesar sees this growth within the human and eventually gives her water as she signs to him that she is thirsty, which leads to a phenomenal payoff where she infiltrates a prison and asks Caesar if he's thirsty. He didn't eat and drink with the other apes, as I mentioned previously. So with the help of all the other apes, she is able to give him food and water, which he is in desperate need of. But if the humans found her in the prison, she would be given their cruel form of mercy. So Rocket steps in, creating a diversion for her to escape, and so begins the prison breakout segment, which is fun and fast-paced to watch. I'm a sucker for prison break stories, and this one is told with such bold direction. As I said earlier, this film is really dark and hard to watch at times. It takes risks with its storytelling, which are beyond satisfying to watch, and the risks absolutely pay off in this film. Everything pays off in this film. It's a great conclusion to all of the plot threads as they are culminated and brought together from what the entire trilogy has been building up towards. Now, in conclusion, the characters' actions make sense in how they interact with others. Maurice being a voice of reason and Caesar not taking much of a liking being compared to Cobra is full of their distinctive character, as we've learned to know and love over the course of the trilogy, with excellent payoffs that serve the story, and these characters rather than just act as fan service. So there certainly are the fan payoffs that you would expect going into a trilogy ender, but they come second to advancing the plot line and ultimately delivering an experience to watch unfold before you. Like when Maurice finally talks, he tells the girl the name he has given her, Nova, and him telling the girl this rather than signing it to her is what gives her a true sense of identity, and it emphasizes Maurice's ability to care for humans. It's an expression of what his character has been built up to become, and it's the ultimate culmination of his arc throughout this trilogy. Caesar's turn is worrying and keeps us constantly invested in his character, and the film is constantly emotional with death around every corner. Luba gives Nova a flower, to which when he dies she gives him back the flower, and God, it's emotional. I'm not crying, you're crying. Now, Caesar in the end, spoiler alert, winds up dying from the wound given to him by the very human in which he showed mercy to at the beginning of the film. The irony there is so cruel, but it's such a phenomenal payoff, showing us that humans aren't so easy to forgive, and that Caesar made a mistake in his naivety with an ape that worked for the humans, finally seeing the death and destruction as humans were causing around him, and choosing to save Caesar by blowing up the humans that was about to finish him off, in other words. And so naturally this gives Caesar a window to blow up the wall and give the apes a chance to escape from the wrath and the fire which they are under with the humans, constantly firing at them from this wall, mind you. Again, the only reason why Caesar wasn't on the other side of the wall, on the receiving end of that gunfire, like he should have been alongside the other apes, is because he couldn't let go of his hate and still wanted to go for his revenge against the Colonel, and that is ultimately what allowed him to save the last few remaining apes. So even in his hatred, he is able to do something magnificent and sacrificial towards his people that ultimately gives them the fighting chance they need to escape. Through his hatred, he saves them. That is what a creative premise to carry forward with this plotline. I truly cannot express with words how incredible it is, and it's so nice to see this arc of the ape that was working with the humans finally saving the apes, by saving Caesar. You know, we've seen through his perspective how he sees the violence and his regret in his doing of it, you know, his part he plays in the picture, in other words. And so seeing that perspective of his is just ultimately what makes this arc have such an incredible and poignant payoff to it. And when Caesar finds the Colonel, there is a full circle being drawn here, as he can choose to shoot him, but the Colonel got the disease, so instead Caesar left him with the option of having to harshly show himself mercy by shooting himself in the head. Ultimately, Caesar gets his revenge in the cruelest way possible by not giving the Colonel an easy way out and forcing him to inflict that mercy he has been shown throughout the film upon himself. And might I just say that Woody Harrelson's performance of this character is ultimately what makes the character so layered and believable, because he just brings so much intimidation to the role through his dialogue delivery. You know, I merely alluded to his performance earlier, now I am telling you just how expressive and incredible it is. He builds the tension in the scenes he's in, as he is rather an intimidating force with great charisma, so therefore that gives him everything I look for in a good villain. And the fact that this film can blend itself tonally so perfect is a great way to give relief from the dark and unforgiving nature of the plot, and better yet, those tonal shifts could have been a problem, but they weren't, because they're inserted at the perfect interval, adding back to the perfect structure of the plotline and how scenes transition so smoothly into one another with intent and purpose. There isn't a single scene here that feels wasted, because they are there to add to the overall experience of this film, because I can't emphasize enough that this is not a film you watch, this is a film which you experience with the tense rollercoaster of emotions that make it so memorable. This film remains on your mind long after the credits roll, and there is an entire character dedicated to the comic relief to create these tonal shifts, but this character is so likeable and full with charm and a distinctive personality that you can't help but like him and enjoy the comedic value he brings to the film. Overall, it's an emotional, visually stunning payoff for everything that has been built up before it, achieving unrivaled highs. And the final conclusion, watching Maurice and Caesar's final interaction together as Caesar slowly dies, ending off the trilogy in a truly poignant and emotional beat. What an experience this was, is all I can say about all that. I could say more, I'm just not, which is why the least has been said all the same. And I still remember going to the cinema for atmosphere as the credits roll, leaving. Everyone clapped as they all knew that they had seen something incredible. This film is easily getting a 10 out of 10 from me, and that rounds off my review for the entirety of the trilogy. Critically, on Rotten Tomatoes, the scores get higher as the films go along, and I seem to fall into the same ranking of the films myself personally. I think the worst film is Rise, followed by Dawn, and capped off with War as the best of the trilogy in my eyes. A trilogy which gets better each installation of the series. But with all that being said and done, I hope you enjoyed the video, and man, can I just tell you, after I watched Dawn, I thought nothing could top that, but then I watched War, and my mind was just blown with it being the best of the trilogy, because that is the rare case where the final blockbuster feeling trilogy, of course, iteration winds up being the best of them all. I cannot, in good conscience, end off this video without first thanking all of my incredible channel members whose continued support help make these videos possible. Without them, these videos would be near impossible to make, so from the bottom of my heart, I truly appreciate every last one of them. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, there are plenty of options on screen now to explore, and please consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. On that note, this video is coming to an end, so thank you so much as always for watching. Until the next video arises, peace!